Has the quality of comics gone down over time? Has the paper gotten worse? Has the printing gotten worse? It's a complicated question. So let me try and dissect it. Hey there, this is Perch. Talking about comic quality, and this has come up because a number of YouTube videos have been made talking about kind of ink coming off on your hands while you're reading comics, and kind of using it as an example of cutting costs and cutting costs leading to worse comics. And so, is that true? It's more complicated than that. So let me kind of answer that by saying a few things. Um, First, you got to think about comics not in terms of, how fragile are they, but in terms of who are you? Are you a reader or are you a collector? Because the bar is going to be different depending on what you are. If you're a collector, then the answer is, comics today are a little less robust than they were in the past. And this is a very kind of general statement. And if I had some comic creators and some different collectors on here, they might give you a little bit of a different answer. But the paper and the quality of comics from there's a period probably in the 70s and the 80s, probably in that zone, where it became very well understood how to care for those comics. You definitely had this kind of effect of page yellowing. You had some known quality deficiencies that would occur in comics, but they were known, they were understood, and they were kind of tolerated. Meaning, if you had something that had a little bit of yellowing, but generally pretty good, still considered mint. Whereas today, comics are there's the standard has changed a little bit, because there hasn't been kind of this baked in acceptance of the last 20 years or so. And by the way, if you were in the 90s selling comics and you worked in a comic shop, you heard a lot of complaints about comics in the 80s about how the pages yellowed and how certain things were frustrating, and comics should be more like the early 70s and the 60s, back when comics were in really good condition. It's just kind of this moving bar where you come to accept certain things about a comic's quality, and then paper and printing and other standards change, and we haven't all kind of wrapped our heads around how those are going to weather yet. So any weathering is seen as worse than the weathering we know from the 80s. Hopefully that makes sense. The other part of it too is that in the 90s, people started messing around with different concepts, be it chromium covers or die cut covers, or trading cards that were inserted into comics. So all those kind of gimmicks that went on had a depreciating effect on the comic. If a comic had some, was packed in a bag, then the bag didn't age well. The bag would get brittle. No one really knew what a bag would do after 30 years. If there were trading cards in the comic, then over time, the settling kind of natural state of the comic would cause the pages to crease a little bit more. And then there was also kind of an adventure. I mean, I could have a Peter Samedi on. He could tell you, the ins and the outs and the backwards and sideways of all of this stuff. But there was, there's kind of different paper and different printing standards. And for a period of time, and I want to say it was probably the mid 90s to kind of the mid 2000s, where there was a lot of just, for lack of a better word, experimentation going on. And you had different kind of vendors being set up, you had different things happening, and so you had different results. You also had different transfer of ink at different times, so that's also true. The one thing that's true about comics, I would say, of the last 10 to 15 years, is that they're more susceptible to humidity. And when I say that, I mean, like, you take the comic and you have changing weather, whether it's colder or hotter or more humid or less humid, or more likely moving from a kind of air conditioned shop into a car, into a house. That kind of change of environment caused page rippling. And I'm saying this in a very kind of high level layman's terms. Again, I don't pretend to be the world expert on comic pages and kind of the different techniques that are being used. But I will say, just as seeing comics come in the door, go out the door, what they do just from a basic storage perspective. There's just some waviness that starts to occur in pages that is, the people are trying to combat that by like really pressing them into a bag and a board. But even there, the board itself can age poorly over time. If you are a collector, meaning you're trying to achieve the absolute highest standard of comics quality, and I see in most comic buyers and people collecting comics, you have kind of three tiers. You have, comic collector, top level, and you have comic collector serious, and then you just have kind of reader. And the very serious comic collector is going to have to kind of wrap their heads around the idea of having, temperature controlled storage for the comics. They're going to have to wrap their heads around the fact they're going to have to rebag and board and refresh those bags and boards every couple of years, especially if they're using bags and boards from, say, the 90s. There was a lot of very brittle bags and boards that were not coated well. The coating started to transfer off onto the comic. And so if you're a super serious collector and you're not doing that recycling of your comics, then your comics are going to go from mint to near mint. That's going to happen. That keeping the comic in a certain state requires upkeep, regardless of the era when it is printed in. And I will say that probably as a very general rule of thumb, some of the paper and some of the techniques used back in the 80s, maybe early 90s, were probably a little bit more resilient to the elements than today, but by very little. But then that's not usually what people are talking about. When you see these videos and you hear these people talk about ink coming off on your hands and those kinds of issues, they're not talking about, what I just talked about. They're not talking about super collector level. What they've done is they've heard things like, hey, the covers of Marvel and DC comics, more Marvel, but it's unfair to tag it to any one company. Indie comics have the same problem. If you take a nice back cover and it's printed black, just a solid black back cover, we've seen a few of those, and you're holding it in your hand, and let's say your hand is not dry, it's just got a slight bit of humidity to it, maybe a slight bit of sweat to your hand. And I'm not talking like super sweat. I'm just talking like rub your hand right now, kind of in your palm. Do you feel like, does it feel like paper or do you feel like a slight warmth or a slight, let's be honest, a slight humanity to your hands? Do you feel like a corpse or do you feel like a human being? If you feel like a human being, you've probably got a little bit of heat to your hands, a little bit of imperfection on the fingers. You can feel the ridges of a fingernail or thumbprint or fingerprint, and a slight, very slight tackiness. That is just how people's hands are. My hands aren't sweaty right now, but if I grab my hand and cram the fingers into the palm and I hold it there for 3 seconds and I lift them up, it doesn't feel like two pieces of rock touching each other. It feels like a human hand and kind of what happens with human hands. So if you have that, if you have human hands and you hold one of those comics and you hold it in your your lap for half an hour or however long it takes you to read a comic, who's taking a half an hour to read a comic? I don't know. Not me. I wish it took a half an hour to read the comic. I feel better about the $3.99 price tag. But anyway, let's say it even takes you 10 minutes to read that comic. If you haven't moved your hand around a lot, if you've just had your fingers resting there on the back cover, then what you're going to discover if you look closely is some of that heat, that transfer of your fingers has gone onto the page. And now you've got either some small fingerprints on the back cover or your fingers have stuck ever so slightly. So now instead of a nice, smooth, crisp back cover, you have some slight indentation where your fingers are. These aren't big deals. This isn't enough to have your comic go from, near mint to poor. It's, in fact, it would probably still be near mint, depending on how, what you were doing with that comic. But anyway, some people, especially people I think who do videos, they're holding the comic in place. They're trying to juggle a camera in some cases, and they're doing their video. They would notice that the tackiness of the finger, the sweatiness of the finger, caused their fingers to stick a little bit to the back cover. And then that became another thing to kind of complain about for the comic. Of like, oh, look, the ink is coming off of my hands. Look at this trash comic cover. And the reality is most comics behave that way. There's a different kind of sheen, a different print for earlier comics or to cardstock comics. God forbid, I've heard some people say, everything should be printed in foil or chromium covers type because that didn't cause any damage to the paper. That's just kind of crazy talk. Yes, granted, your fingers won't stick to the back cover, but you'll have different problems. That is also a true statement. But I mean, in general, I think the it's not true to say, hey, the big publishers are using such trash printing mechanisms that the comic is coming off, because it's the game of telephone where you say one thing and it goes around to like 30 people, and you kind of in secret. By the time it gets all the way back around to the first person, the original story has shifted. It's a bit of how this story has gone. It started out with, hey, these covers, I've been holding this comic and my fingers have stuck to the pages. It's kind of the first story. And as it goes around from like 20 different people or videos, then it becomes, these comics are such trash that the ink is coming off. I've heard some people say that, they open up the comic and they look on the interior pages and the ink has smudged onto itself. Like, one page's ink is kind of merged to the other page and you got this muddy comic. That's not, I don't know what those comics are. I've seen a lot of comics. I have not seen that happen. Granted, I've seen some cases where you have like a comic page and the entire thing is printed, black ink, and it's just this whole page of black ink with maybe one word bubble. It says, no more mutants or something. Yeah, not saying anything in particular, but then the opposing page, the page on the opposite side, feels like it's gotten a little bit of ink burnishing to it. But to be honest with you, if you go back to a lot of the comics in the 70s and 80s, you'll see that and worse. I mean, definitely two pages put up against each other, rubbing against each other, that causes problems. The other thing that happens quite frequently, I would say, is that there's printing mishaps. This is where there's a crease down the page of the book, or it's printed in such a way that staple didn't go through, and you just got a big batch where it was just printed up like crap. And that's something different. That is, I think the blame can be squarely placed on Diamond in a lot of cases. But well, that's not fair. I mean, well, no, you know what? Screw it. It is fair. I think that there's issues kind of in the production of comics that happen all the time, and I will say they seem like they're happening with a little bit more frequency. It seems to go in waves. In the I remember in like 91 to 93, there were a lot of comics that came in that had like the weird little foreskin that would happen in the corner, where like the page is folded over and you got this extra little bit of paper. It's like hanging out of the comic. It's probably the worst description ever I could think for that. There's been a lot of those cases, and they seem to, then things get normal for a while, like 4 or 5 years, and then you go through another 2 year stint where you just seem to get real problems. And I don't know if that's just me or there's something to that, but there does seem to be this kind of rolling problems that crop up in kind of printing and piecing the comic together. But anyway, that's from my perspective, the truth of the situation. I do wish, I mean, like all things, I know this is a very repeated comment that I've made on my channel a lot, is that I wish people would stick to kind of the truth, or not truth, just the facts, with less exaggeration, because it is that game of telephone where you get kind of one person saying, hey, this comic is trash, the paper quality is worse, and then the next guy is doing a video based on some things that they heard in the first video. So whenever, not just in comics, in anything, whenever I'm listening to a news story or I'm listening to a podcast, and they say something like the podcast says, I was listening to a different podcast and they said this, and I'm going to react to the thing that the first podcast said, I always have this feeling of suspicion, like I'm about to get this watered down kind of munged story. And that's usually how it feels, is that I'm getting some kind of carbon copy of a story. So again, that's just me. That I like to hear things from the source wherever possible. That's why when I'm not a news junkie, but I'll go look and I'll see stories. It's like, oh, the president said this. Here's my analysis. Like, you know what? Skip your analysis. I want to just hear the original clip, please. I'd like to just. I want to hear what was said, and then I'll form my own analysis, and then I'll listen to your analysis. But I encourage people to go look for themselves, and I think that's true. Next time you go to a comic shop, ask the store manager or whoever's working the desk. Ask them what they think about comic pages. What do they see coming in the door? And then, pick up some comics yourself, see what you feel. In all things, I think it's a big difference. If you're a collector, like a rabid collector who's wanting your comics to be mint absolutely perfect, then there's just a whole different ball game for you. I think there you should be reading it sounds silly. You should have gloves in some cases, how you're reading your comic. You should be cautious about how you're reading it. You probably don't want to read it at all. You probably want to get your comic from a place that's immediately going to put it in a bag and a board right from the box, and you're going to buy digital to actually read the story. That's probably what you want to do. I think that's the only thing that makes sense. If you're that level of collector, then none of this really matters. You got to be having a whole different game. Anyway, there you go. Somebody had asked that I talk about this topic, so hope that helped. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notification, share with a friend, and follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch. Thanks for listening.